Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jack Cunningham. I'm program coordinator at the Bill Graham Center for Contemporary International History here at the Monk School and Trinity College at the University of Toronto. And it's a pleasure to welcome you all to our event this afternoon, our virtual book launch of Margaret Macmillan's new book, War, How Conflict Shaped Us. Now, Margaret is one of the foremost historians in the English-speaking world. She taught for many years at Ryerson, then at U of T, where she was, among other things, provost of Trinity College. She's been affiliated for a long time with Oxford University, where she was warden of St. Anthony's College. And she is the author of numerous important historical tomes, including Paris 1919, The War That Ended Peace, and Nixon in China. A few years back, she delivered the Massey Lectures for CBC and Massey College. And in 2018, she delivered the Reith Lectures for the BBC, which I believe formed the nucleus of your current book, Margaret. War, how conflict made us. So let's begin with a little conversation. We'll have a conversation with Margaret, then we'll open it up to Q&A for those of you in the audience. Please use the built-in Zoom Q&A function for that. And I should mention that the book is available in a few days, but it's available for pre-order through numerous outlets, and there are handy links to them at Margaret's website, margaretmacmillan.com. So without further ado, Margaret, thank you for joining us.
Well, it's a great pleasure, and thank you for that nice commercial. That was kind of you.
Not at all. Now, Margaret, you have written before about war and about topics touching on war, most notably the First World War. Paris 1919 was all about the peace conference that drew the curtain on that conflict, and The War That Ended Peace covered the years leading up to the war and the tangled question of its origins. I'm curious as to what motivated you to look into war as a more general phenomenon. And secondly, once you got started on this project, what most surprised you?
Well, I got started on the project, I think, because I was asked to give some lectures. And being asked to give lectures, you have to think of something new to say. You can't just lecture if it's a special series like the Massey Lectures, or in this case, the Reith Lectures for the BBC. You can't just use something you've already lectured about. And it is quite a good chance to think about something you've wanted to spend a bit of time on, but haven't really thought about before. And I was asked to give the Reith Lectures, and they said, what would I like to talk about? And we batted around various ideas. And then I suddenly said, well, what about just talking about war and different aspects of war and what it means to our societies and what it means to us? And they thought it was a good idea. And it got me doing more research and thinking more about something that I've thought about on and off. Because if you study the history of the 19th and 20th centuries, war comes in a lot, as you can imagine. Indeed, war comes in a lot to most history. And so having to give the lectures got me thinking. And then I thought, once you do the work for the lectures, you think, well, I have enough perhaps to make a book. And so that's how it all started.
Okay. You mentioned that when we look at modern history, we inevitably find ourselves looking at war. But there are still those who see war as something of a tragic aberration in history. They tend to assume that peace is the norm in the human condition. Do you think this view is really tenable?
I don't think peace is the norm in the human condition, nor is war. I think that the two alternate with each other. I think a lot of us want peace and we long for peace, but we live with the uncomfortable reality that you get war. And I'm sometimes asked when I'm talking about war, why don't you talk about peace instead? And I think the sort of assumption behind the question is that we should focus on something more pleasant like peace and not look at something like war. And my answer to that is that war is such an embedded part of human history and has had such impact on human history and has had such impact on human societies, and including our own and including many societies in the world today, that we need to look at it. And that the conditions that produce war are conditions that exist there in peacetime. And so one of the interesting questions for me is why, when you have tensions in peacetime within countries or between countries, internationally or nationally, why don't those turn into war? How do we avoid war? And I think the more we try and understand how wars start, perhaps the more hope we have of making peace. And so I don't see war as an aberration. Unfortunately, also, I think the more you look at the whole long pattern of human history, at least from the time we began to get records or began to get evidence to record it, we see that war has been very much a part of human evolution. There are very few societies, I can't think of any in this world, that haven't had wars at some point or another. And a great many societies have spent a lot of time organizing for war, planning war, waging war. And so I just simply think that if you're going to study the past, it's one of the things you have to take into account. And I'm not thinking particularly of military history, although that's interesting. I mean, is a whole sort of field that looks at battles and regiments and weapons, and that's, I find, very interesting. But I'm looking more at the waging of war, the history of war itself. And it seems to me this is something that is one of those great forces affecting human history, just as pandemics do, just as economics does, just as demography does, just as geography does, just as political institutions do. It's simply, if we want to understand the human past, we need to understand something about how war fits in and what difference wars have made.
Okay. Well, if we're going to when we look at questions of war, we pretty soon find ourselves coming up against the question of how and why it is that wars break out in the first instance. Now, the systematic study of war, I suppose, arguably began with Thucydides in his history of the Peloponnesian War, and he argued that war began with the growth in the power of one state and the alarm this caused in another. And he believed that this would be the case for as long as the laws of human nature remained more or less constant. Do you think that each war is really unique in the manner of its outbreak, or was Thucydides right? And are there similarities, or at least patterns, that we can discern?
I think there are similarities and patterns, but I think we shouldn't think that these are laws, rigid laws. I mean, Thucydides said, and it was only one line in the Peloponnesian Wars, the Peloponnesian Wars started because Sparta feared the growing power of Greece. And this has become now a sort of dogma in certain circles. It's called, I never can pronounce it, it's a Thucydides trap, which argues that when you have a rising power and a declining power, they're almost bound to fight each other.
Yeah.
And I think that's too predictive, it's too tight, because we've also had examples in history of declining and rising powers who come to terms. In the United States and the British Empire in the 1890s, we're talking about war over the Venezuelan borders and over who was going to be dominant in the new world. And there was talk of war in both countries, and on both sides there were cooler heads who managed to avoid it. So I think it's like it is possible that war will happen when you get these circumstances. But I think if you're looking at the causes of war, I mean, there are all sorts of very specific reasons. You know, someone insults someone, someone bombs someone, something goes wrong, an archduke gets assassinated. But if you look behind the very proximate, immediate causes of wars, I think you'll find they tend to fall into three groups, very, very roughly. I think wars start sometimes because people are greedy for something. One side wants something the other side has, whether that's land or various forms of loot, from gold to paintings to human beings. Wars will start out of greed. And I think a second main reason is fear. Wars start because people are afraid of what their neighbors might be up to, or they feel they have no choice but to fight. And then I would put a third broad category, and these are all very broad categories. I'd put a third category of sort of what I would call ideologies and ideas. And so these are the sorts of things that make people feel they have a cause, like Daesh or ISIS had, that they had a cause to try and build a second caliphate here in the Middle East, or Marxism, Bolshevism, which saw a cause and believed that waging war to achieve that cause was a good thing, or nationalism. And so I think when you really look at wars, it tends to be those three main categories: greed, fear, and the power of ideas or ideologies.
Okay. Well, war as a phenomenon is full of paradoxes, and one of them, I think, is that while we immediately tend to think of the destructiveness it the destructiveness of war, there have also been times when it's acted as a stimulus to social reform or to technological innovation. In that context, do you think that it's fair to see war as, in some peculiar ways, a positive phenomenon?
Well, I don't think we want to think of it like that, but yes, I mean, it's not a positive phenomenon, but I think positive things come out of war. And we wouldn't wage war to get those positive things, but nevertheless, it is one of the paradoxes of war that sometimes things change for the better. But the cost, of course, is often very high indeed. But you mentioned social change.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've had very beneficial social changes as a result of great wars. There's a very interesting historian at Stanford called Walter Scheidel, who's written a book called The Great Leveler.
Mm-hmm.
And as when you get great catastrophes such as pandemics or starvation or revolution or war, you will often find that societies become actually fairer, that the gap between the very rich and the very poor is compressed. And he has, I think, a very interesting argument, well backed up by evidence, that the two world wars actually helped to create more equal societies in a number of countries, including, of course, Canada, but including Britain and the United States, because the rich were obliged to pay taxes and governments were obliged to give benefits to the poor to gain their support and to keep the whole war effort going. And so I think wars can bring about very necessary social change. Women, I think, have benefited in the 20th century from wars. I mean, before the First World War, a lot of women were asking for votes in a number of countries, and they were told, usually by the males dominating those countries, that they didn't need a vote, they wouldn't know what to do with it, they weren't fitted to take part in public affairs, and they couldn't come out into society and do many of the jobs that men were doing. And then, of course, the war came, and the First and Second World Wars were so demanding, and they needed people who could work in the factories and needed people who could do all the jobs that the men had been doing who went off to war. And so women showed in the course of those wars that they could do everything from working on assembly lines to driving buses to driving tractors. In the Second World War, they flew airplanes, they often delivered fighter planes or bombers from one place to another. And at the end of those wars, it was no longer possible to make the argument that women really couldn't play any part in the wider society. And so the position of women, I think, often changed for the better as a result of war, as in fact did the position of labor. The working classes tend to come out, or in certain countries, came out of great wars better off. The welfare state in Britain was set up after the Second World War, very largely because the government recognized, and the ruling classes in Britain recognized, that they had to do something about society. And so wars can produce social changes. And as you mentioned, they can also produce great technological changes. And again, we wouldn't choose that route to get the technological changes, but a number of things that happen in wars have actually benefited society. A lot of things happened during the Cold War. Huge amounts of money were poured into research. And a number of things, that transistors, microprocessors, a lot of things were developed for military reasons, which then had an application in society as a whole. And in medicine, penicillin was discovered before the Second World War, but it was too expensive, it was thought, to put into production. And then the Second World War came and suddenly it wasn't too expensive. And so a drug that was going to save literally millions of lives was produced and had an enormous impact in peacetime as well as in war. And so war, again, we don't like to think of it like this, and we shouldn't make, we wouldn't make war to get these things happening, but war can bring changes which in peacetime benefit large sections of society.
Well, I'm just reminded of Thomas Piketty's recent book, which makes a similar argument. He argues that the great compression of incomes that occurred throughout much of the first 2/3 of the 20th century was really driven by the necessities of war.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting line of argument. Another paradox of war is the peculiar ambivalence with which we regard the soldier or the warrior. I mean, the warrior's function is to kill, but yet we also have a regard for the warrior. We often speak quite fondly of the martial virtues, and in public life, admiration has often gone to those who've demonstrated martial prowess.
Yeah.
All the way from George Washington to John McCain. You open one of your chapters with again, we're back to Thucydides, with a quote from Pericles' funeral oration, in which he says there's really no better way to be remembered than as a defender of the city. And that's a sentiment that seems to persist despite the fact that the warrior is trained to kill. Do you think it's persuasive to see war as enabling both our best behavior and our worst?
Yes, I do, Jack. I think that's putting it very well. I think we admire those who fight because they're prepared to risk their lives for a cause, and often that cause is the people they're fighting with. One of the things that seems to keep soldiers in the field is the comradeship they feel, and they will do things for each other. Often at the sacrifice of their lives, and this comes out again and again in the memoirs, and the awards, the Victoria Crosses or the military crosses that are given for soldiers and for the military are often for great valor, for risking their lives and sometimes dying in order to save their fellows. And so I think we admire those qualities, that capacity to think of others and be prepared to sacrifice for others, that altruism. But we also recognize at the same time that war brings out the cruelest side of human nature. I mean, what we're doing is taking people, often ordinary people who didn't intend to be warriors, and turning them into people who are prepared to kill. And that can lead to dreadful atrocities. We know that in almost every war, there will be prisoners who've surrendered who are then shot out of hand, or there will be appalling cruelties exerted on civilians who just happen to be in the wrong place. There will be too many cases, and we know it happens, of those in the military running out of control. In the Vietnam War, the most notorious example was what happened in My Lai village, where a group of trained soldiers attacked a bunch of unarmed villagers. There was absolutely no reason, I think very little reason, to suspect that these villagers were in fact supporting the Americans' enemies. And men, women, and children, including babies, were killed in a sort of rampage. And so I think it's one of the things that we puzzle about war. It is at once, I think, brings out nobility. On the other side, it brings out the basest cruelty. And I think we perhaps tend to glorify it a bit. I mean, if you go to bookstores, I'm always struck by how many books there are on war. I mean, we're fascinated by it. And some of the great works of art of any society have been works of art about war. The Iliad, one of the great books in Western literature, is written about war. And it exalts, I think, the military virtues, and it shows a respect for those who die in battle. It doesn't mourn them. It simply regards them as having given their lives for a useful purpose. And you think of the great paintings, and some of them, of course, are deeply critical of war. Dürer, Goya in particular, the horrors of war that they portray, I think, also produce great art. But it's complicated. I think our relationship to war is very complicated. And I think even in peaceful societies like Canada, sort of fascination with war. I mean, so many video games. I must confess, I don't play a lot of video games, but so many video games are about war. And I think there is a fascination that runs through our society and many other societies about war. It's not something I can explain, but it seems to me to be very deeply rooted in human society.
Well, when we talk about the warrior, we are, with a few exceptions, such as the Amazons and Queen Bode, talking about men. Mm-hmm. Most warriors have been male. Why do you think this is so?
Well, I can't say definitively, because this is an argument that's been going on for some time, and I suspect will go on for a long time. I mean, war is deeply gendered. It is probably true that, I mean, who knows what the statistics are, but you're right. I mean, I would say 99% or more of those who have fought have been men. And is that because of biology? Is it because they have certain biological features that make them tougher, or they have more testosterone that makes them more aggressive? I mean, these are debates, but I tend to think it's as much culture. Clearly, there may be biological factors, but when you look at the range, I mean, you will have women who are as strong as some men. It's not that men are always stronger or that men are always braver. And I think women have often the same sort of characteristics that would make good warriors. But I think for much of history and in most of human society, it's been expected that men will fight and women will stay home tend the hearth, raise the children. But there is evidence that when women do become warriors, they can in fact be very effective warriors. And it used to be thought that Amazons were just myths that the Greeks had made up to scare themselves about the horrible prospect of women who fought. But in fact, a lot of archaeology that is now taking place and has taken place around the Black Sea, for example, is finding tombs of skeletons, very, very old skeletons in armor, and they've now been able to identify them thanks to modern DNA and new methods of archaeology. They've been able to identify these skeletons as female skeletons, and the skeletons often bear the marks of what look like violent attacks, you know, broken bones, or it looks like they died violently. And there have been occasional famous, there was a famous group of warriors in Dahomey in Africa, in the kingdom of Dahomey in the 18th and 19th centuries, where the king had a bodyguard of warriors who were apparently formidable warriors, very hard, very, 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 very strong, trained very well. And those who fought against them, including French soldiers, really found them difficult. And we now see women going into the armed services. It used to be that when women went into armed services, they were in support roles, but increasingly now we have women fighter pilots, women's captains of ships, women in combat roles. And so I tend to think the reason that so many warriors have been men is much more cultural than biological. But it's an interesting debate, and it's one that goes on, and I don't think it's been settled yet.
Okay. Your chapter on modern warfare opens with an account of the Battle of Valmy in 1793. Do I take it that you agree with David Bell of Johns Hopkins that the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars really marked the beginning of modern warfare? Then what would you see as the defining characteristics of modernity in war?
Well, I think there are two main ones, and I do agree that something changed in the nature of war in the 19th century. I mean, if you look at 18th century war, it was war fought by professional armies and navies. In other words, the ordinary citizen or subject was not expected to fight. And in fact, you didn't put good people in as ordinary soldiers or ordinary sailors. You sent off people who you felt were expendable. And often in Britain, convicted criminals were given the choice of going into the army or being executed. And so sometimes they chose the army because it was slightly better than being hanged. And I think what changed with the French Revolution was the relationship between government and society. Before the 19th century, in most countries, people were subjects. You were subjects of your king or the queen or an emperor or an empress, or subjects of a duke. And so the notion of citizenship, that you were a free member of a society and you had a participating role in that society and you had an obligation to that society, for the most part, didn't exist, although there were countries like Sweden and of course in the United States with the American War of Independence, and in Britain, where you're beginning to get a notion that people had a citizenship which was not given to them by their ruler. It was something they were born with. But what the French Revolution did is, by throwing over the old regime and by creating an elected government, created, I think, very much the idea that the government belonged to the people and that the people were citizens of the country. Now, what that meant is that they had their own government and they felt a different relationship with it than they might have felt with Louis the 17th. But what they also had was an obligation to that government. If the government is something that you vote for and the government is something that you participate in choosing, then you have an obligation to defend that government, and you have an obligation to defend your society, your nation, because you are now part of something which belongs to you. And so the notion that people are citizens rather than subjects, I think, makes a difference to how people wage war, that it now became something you wanted to do, to defend your nation and to defend your government. What also happened in the 19th century, and that this was fostered by not just the French Revolution, but it was fostered by the spread of literacy, by the spread of communication, so that more and more people came to feel themselves part of a larger group called the nation. What also happened in the 19th century is it became possible not just to have more people who might want to fight, it became possible to use them, because the Industrial Revolution meant that suddenly factories, or not suddenly, but over the years, factories could produce the sorts of things you needed for war on assembly lines. Things that had once, like guns that had once been produced by hand, and you can imagine how long that would take, were now being produced day after day after day on assembly lines. And you could provide the sorts of uniforms that soldiers needed, you could provide the food that they needed. And equally importantly, you had new means of communication, the railway and the steamship in particular, which meant that you could move vast numbers of people around, you could put them in the field, and you could keep them there, which you wouldn't have been able to do in the old days. And so I think war is transformed in the Middle Age, partly because of the changing relationship between people and their governments, but also partly because of the changes in both technology and production that are brought about by the Industrial Revolution, which is why we begin to see very big and increasingly lengthy wars.
Okay. Well, we often assume that total war, with the perils that it poses to civilians, is a distinctly modern phenomenon. Yet, if we look at accounts of ancient wars, the inhabitants of captured cities were often put to the sword or sold into slavery. And if we read, for example, Peter Wilson's very good history of the 30 Years' War, we see that it was that conflict was terrible indeed in its consequences for civilians. What do you think war has meant for civilian populations throughout history?
Well, I think there have been limited wars in the past where the people who have fought have been those trained to fight. The warriors have fought. But when you get the sense of a society against a society, if you think it's not just those people out there in the ships who are fighting it, it's not just those people who are the soldiers, it's the whole lot of them. It is an existential struggle of one type of society against another. I mean, Rome in the Punic Wars felt that Carthage was out to destroy it utterly, and Carthage felt that Rome was out to destroy it. And so when Rome won the Punic Wars, it did its best to destroy Carthage. And in the famous line, it sowed the fields with salt so that the Carthaginians could no longer grow their own food. And they razed the cities, leveled the cities of Carthage in North Africa so that no memory of Carthage would be left. And those sorts of wars, I think, are the most dangerous of all. A war that is fought by professional soldiers for limited means can be ended more easily than those sorts of wars which pit a whole society against each other. And in the 30 Years' War, of course, you've got the complicating factor of religion, so that the Protestants were fighting Catholics, and they weren't just fighting those Catholic soldiers in front of them or those Protestant soldiers in front of them. What they were doing was fighting a whole vision of the relationship between man and God and a whole vision of society. And so those on the other side were not just people they happened to be fighting over a bit of land or something. Those on the other side were people who were wrong and who were wicked. I mean, the rhetoric in the 30 Years' War often is of destroying the other side, destroying them all, men, women, and children, because the women produce the future soldiers, the children will grow up to be future soldiers. And I think we see this again in the 19th and 20th centuries, where you get these wars where everyone on the other side is part of what you're fighting. And, you know, you see it, of course, civil wars are almost the worst, but in the American Civil War, you know, the Northern generals like Sherman said, we are going to destroy Southern society and make them not want to fight on. And so the ferocity with which wars are fought, I think often it's much greater when I think there's ideology or religion involved.
Okay. When you're touching on the American Civil War, you write about Francis Lieber and the Lieber Code, which is perhaps the first modern attempt to codify legal restrictions on war, and really the ancestor of more modern instruments like the Geneva Conventions. How successful do you think that efforts to impose such restrictions on war have been, and how successful do you think they're likely to be in the future?
Yeah. Well, it may seem futile. It may seem like trying to dam a great sort of enormous river with a very small and flimsy dam, but we keep on trying. And as far as the history of war goes back, we have tried, humans have tried to try and limit in some way, so that they have had sort of rules about how you treat prisoners of war, or days on which you won't fight. And the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, would not fight when the Olympics were on. And in the Middle Ages, the church in Europe tried to enforce days when you did not fight, holy days. It was considered wrong to fight on Easter or Christmas Day and saints' days. And of course, the church tried to expand that. And so we've always tried to have rules and regulations about how to fight. And of course, they've often been broken, because when people are in the throes of a great conflict, they will often break the rules, but we keep trying. And you're right, we have developed rules in the course of the 19th century. I mean, this was a century in which war became more deadly and all-encompassing, But it was also a century in which people began to talk about internationalism, began to talk about the international order, began to develop a respect for laws and for rules. And what you got in the 19th century, along with the development of more deadly and devastating wars, you also got the development of rules, regulations, attempts to limit war, attempts to get rid of war altogether. I mean, the late 19th century saw a huge peace movement where people were trying to get rid of war altogether. But a number of steps were taken. The Geneva Conventions, which started in the 1860s, which dealt with how prisoners should be treated and dealt with how civilians should be treated. And then at the end of the 19th century, there were a couple of big disarmament conferences at The Hague, and that gave rise to a whole set of Hague Conventions about how wars should be fought, about what were legitimate targets and not, about what weapons should be used. We still have such rules, and in fact, we've been adding to them. I mean, we still have rules about not using chemical warfare, for example, even though those rules get broken. But we still, I think, collectively disapprove of the breaking of the rules, and we still have rules about how prisoners are meant to be taught. How prisoners are meant to be treated. And we keep on trying to develop conventions and international treaties on disarmament or getting rid of certain types of weapons. We haven't always been successful, but I think it is important that we keep trying. And we have, in some cases, managed to limit at least some of the worst sides of war. I mean, it is, again, war is full of these extraordinary sort of paradoxes, this act of collective violence and organized violence we also try and control.
Okay, well, on that note, let's open it up to questions from our audience. Again, use the Zoom Q&A function to relay your questions, and we'll pass them on. Well, here's one. While writing war, did you find that ideas from your previous two books on World War I helped inform aspects of the new work, or did you find yourself reconsidering some of your previous conclusions from these books as a result of the new one?
Oh, that's interesting. Certainly what I'd done before was a help. And I did look at and draw on things because I looked a lot about the sort of military plans and militarism before the First World War. And I also looked at the attempts to end war in the Paris Peace Conference. I think what I went into more deeply and perhaps would have changed some of what I was thinking about the beginning and end of the First World War was the importance of the technology and the importance of the economic capacities of countries. Because I came to realize, I was writing this book, that types of technology are very important. What is also important is how people use them. Sometimes people come up with wonderful new weapons and nobody wants to use them or knows how to use them. And I found that interesting. And what also I think I came to realize more and more is the interconnectedness of a war effort. I mean, all the different parts have to be working, and the importance of economic mobilization. And one of the reasons I think Germany lost the First World War is in the end, it didn't have the economic capacity of the Allies, even before the United States joined. And the Germans were never as successful as mobilizing their economy and using their resources as effectively as the British did, for example. And so I think I gained a deeper appreciation of just the importance of economic factors, both in making war and ending war.
Okay. Well, not just World War I, but World War II. There is a lively literature on the limits of the German economy as a basis for waging war. Adam Tooze's work on that, for example. Yeah. Do you think that there's a sense in which, well, I guess this is really the old Paul Kennedy thesis that states impoverish themselves trying to wage war or trying to conquer others and expand beyond what their material base can sustain.
Yeah. Well, in the case of Germany, I think, one of in a way, I think Germany's opponents were caught, and Germany perhaps itself in the Second World War was caught by its own propaganda. I mean, the Nazis talked about being modern, they talked about being very efficient, but I think the more historians have looked at the way in which the Nazi war effort was run, and the German economy was mobilized for the war effort, the more they realized that it was chaotic with overlapping responsibilities, tremendous wastage, resources not going to where they were needed. And that the Germans didn't, and I think it was true also in the First World War, they didn't necessarily exploit very successfully the conquered territories. When they went into Ukraine in the Second World War, as you know, a number of villages Ukrainian villages welcomed the Germans initially as liberators because they had suffered so much under the Stalinist regime. And the Germans, Nazis, blinded by their racial theories, treated the Ukrainians as inferiors, treated the Ukrainians appallingly, and as a result, were able to get less cooperation, in fact, created resistance, and were not able to exploit the enormous resources of Ukraine as they might have done if they'd behaved differently. And I think this was something that really counted against the Germans in both the First and Second World Wars, that they didn't organize their own economies at home as efficiently as the British did, and didn't treat the conquered territories in ways that would make them want to at least cooperate, if not willingly. The British, by contrast, I think, mobilized their war economy very well. But what they realized as they were fighting the Second World War was that they were also in the process of well, if not bankrupting themselves, damaging their own position in the world. I mean, I think Winston Churchill was very clear about this, you know, that we may survive this war, but we will be a much lesser power than we were when we went in. But the choice for the British was either to capitulate to the Nazis, the Axis powers, or to fight. And it was a choice they made, and I think a very important choice. But it did result in a Britain that was less powerful, less prosperous at the end of the Second World War. And it of course, was in a world then when the United States had become a superpower, both economically and militarily.
Mm-hmm. Here's another question from our audience. Strategy is an unusual field in that it does not completely fit into military history, sociology, the technical sciences, etc. Why do you think strategy developed into a distinct field of thought?
I think it developed partly in the course of the 19th century, when you had an attempt more generally to apply the methods of science and to try and discover rules which would govern a number of things about human society, including strategy. And of course, the great work on strategy was written towards the beginning of the 19th century by von Clausewitz, in which he tried to work out the ways in which you fight war and the ways in which you set your goals and the ways in which you try to achieve those goals. And the idea that strategy is something that is beyond military tactics. It's not just about winning wars or winning battles. It's about the ways in which you do it. It's about the guiding principles. It's about the goals which you have. And we talk a lot of American universities, for example, and Canadian universities talk about grand strategy. And the overall way in which you bring in all the resources of society, and you're directing the strength and resources of society to achieve a particular aim. So strategy is not just about how to get those ships into a certain place to win a battle. Strategy is about what your longer term plan is. And I think it's a very important field of study. I mean, obviously you can't have a grand strategy without adequate supplies, and logistics are enormously important, and tactics, how you're going to actually win the battles you need to win, are enormously important. But if you don't know what you're doing and why you're doing it, then you're going to get into a terrible muddle. I mean, I think one of the problems that the invasion and occupation forces faced in Iraq, the British and the Americans, is that they didn't really have a clear idea of what they wanted to do after they toppled Saddam Hussein. They wanted to get rid of him, and they hadn't really thought through what their long-term plan was. What was their strategy for Iraq? And I think that helps to explain the catastrophe that we see in Iraq today, and the ongoing violence and the lack of political and social institutions that can help that country. And so strategy, I think, is the grand scheme you have, and the way in which you try and bring your resources to bear on that scheme.
When we've got an audience member here who invites you to comment on populist threats of domestic chaos using informal militia, informal but real civil war, in order to stifle legitimate electoral voting.
I can't think what you're talking about.
No, nor can I.
But no, I think, my definition of war is a very simple one. War is organized violence. And so it involves an organized group which defines itself, however, it could be a gang, and often gangs behave in militarized ways and adopt a sort of uniform and adopt a sort of hierarchy. And so you can have, war is not just about organized military, state military. War, I think, can be any organized group against another organized group, and they're battling and using violence to achieve whatever aim they may have. And I think it's always very worrying for a state when you get people taking violence into their own hands and beginning to organize themselves. I mean, I think one of the problems Mexico has had, for example, is these highly militarized drug gangs who are not just in the business of selling drugs, but are in the business of controlling certain areas. One of the things that I think helped European society and other societies develop in the 16th and 17th centuries was that governments increasingly got a monopoly on violence and began to get rid of the informal militia, began to get local magnates who had their own bands to enforce order in their regions, and began to develop national police forces that could maintain order in society. Now, we all know those can be abused, but I think back to the days, I mean, I wouldn't have wanted to live in the Middle Ages where you had to worry about the lord in the next castle who might try and attack you, or you couldn't travel because there would be gangs who would be trying to take whatever you had. There was a lawlessness. But I think it is very worrying when you begin to get militia, armed militia, who behave in these militarized ways. I mean, this is what happened in Italy in the 1920s with the fascisti at the end of the First World War, which of course helped to propel Mussolini into power. And they used real violence on their enemies, and they intimidated large sections of the population. And the Nazis, of course, before Hitler was invited into power in 1933, intimidated, or did their best to intimidate, their opponents with organized violence. And I find it, quite frankly, appalling when I look at pictures of the United States today. And it's not the only country, but it's the one I think, being Canadian, we're all particularly concerned about. When I see people marching with uniforms, carrying weapons in what are peaceable cities. I mean, I'm trying to remember, was it Illinois that armed militia stormed the state legislature, and legislators were wearing bulletproof vests? I mean, this is not the way to run a peaceable society. And the danger is, of course, when you get this, because you will get people on different parts of the political spectrum. It's by no means only people on the right. It can be people on what we roughly call the left as well. And when you get this, the dangers of armed conflict become much more serious, and authority breaks down. And when people lose faith in the authorities, then of course the temptation is to become part of one of these gangs, or go to them at least for protection.
Do you think that alliances such as NATO are effective at keeping war at bay?
Well, NATO, I think, was effective. It was a defensive alliance. And I think a strong alliance system can deter, and that does help to keep wars at bay. It can deter those who would attack it. I mean, the crucial clause in NATO was an attack on one is an attack on all. What also, of course, acted as a deterrent was the fact that the United States, the most powerful partner in NATO, had nuclear weapons, and by the 1960s had the means of delivering them to the Soviet Union. And so the nuclear weapons, in a terrifying sort of way, helped to keep a balance between the two powers so that neither dared attack the other. No, I think alliances can be very effective. The danger of an alliance always, I think, is that it might provoke some of its members to behave in reckless ways. And sometimes we have this curious, this phenomenon which happens again and again in history, that often the smaller members of alliances will feel emboldened to act with a sort of recklessness because they think they're going to be backed up by the bigger members. And so before the First World War, Russia, which was the protector of Serbia, in fact, the fact that Russia, this enormous power, was its protector and its supporter, gave Serbia a license, I think, or gave Serbian politicians a license to behave in reckless ways. And so alliances work well, I think, when they deter attack. And I think they work well when they keep their members focused on a common cause, but they can also be dangerous. Alliances can draw a whole set of countries into conflicts because one member of the alliance has acted in a reckless way or provoked a conflict.
Do you think the current degree of economic interdependence now makes a truly global war unlikely? Now, this
I,
is a line of argument that we've seen at various other times in the past, going back to Norman Angell at least.
yeah. Well, it's a tempting argument, and it's sort of the nice metaphor people have is that no countries with McDonald's have ever gone to war with each other. The idea that we're all economically interlinked should make war less desirable, but it hasn't in the past. And you mentioned the period before the First World War, when the world was increasingly globalized. I mean, we think we live in the global age, but before the First World War, that was the first great age, if you like, of globalization, when the world was linked increasingly through investment, through trade, through communications, through the movements of peoples. And you think of those millions of peoples who were moving around the world before 1914. I mean, many of them, like my ancestors, who were coming to places like Canada. And so it was a very globalized age. And two of the most powerful nations in that globalized age, Germany and Britain, were each other's biggest trading partners. And there were a lot of those who said this means they won't fight with each other. Why would countries fight with each other when it will hurt their economies and simply damage them? And Norman Angell was this very interesting journalist who wrote a book called The Great Illusion. And it was enormously popular, read everywhere. And he said, there's no point in waging war today. If you take over another country, you won't do as well as you would if you were trading with it. And alas, he was wrong. Unfortunately, economic interdependence doesn't necessarily make countries more friendly. It can often breed resentments on both sides. It can often make them wary of each other. Look at the United States and China today. They are economically quite closely linked. The Chinese hold a great deal of American debt, a great deal of Chinese investment in the United States. The United States sells a lot of its goods to China. And yet relations between those two countries have been getting worse rather than better over the last few years. Now, there are other factors for that, but the economic interdependence hasn't prevented that from happening.
One of our audience members notes that university departments have largely abandoned the study of war. And that's certainly what I see at when I look at most history departments. He writes, they want to teach peace. How can we bring war studies back?
Well, I think we should bring them back as the study of war and not as military history. I mean, military history I see as a subset of the studies of war. The study of war, and it was pioneered by people like Sir Michael Howard, the great British historian, was to study war as part of society, to look at war as something that is affected by culture, by society, which in turn affects it, and to see war not as something that happens over there, not something that happens just for a short period of time, but to see war as an integral part of society, much as we'd see trade and investment, or much as we'd see the development of international ideas as parts of society. And I do think we should study it. I mean, I think unfortunately there's a view in a number of history departments and among perhaps a lot of historians, that those who study war are somehow fascinated by power and warmongering, that they'd actually like to be warriors themselves and go off and fight. And this, I think, is nonsense. I mean, I don't want to put on a uniform and go and fight anywhere. But what I want to do is try and understand a very important part of human history and human society. And I think we need to, it's like, I mean, there's so many things we need to study in history. I mean, I don't think history is about one view of the past. I think history is about a complicated, multi-layered view of the past, and war is part of that. And there are, some very, very good young historians who are studying war, but they're looking at things like war and gender. They're looking at things like war and science. They're looking at things like war and ideas, or the impact of religion on war. And it seems to me these are deeply important questions, and they should be part of university history departments. I think other sorts of historians, those who are studying domestic issues, those who are studying politics, those who are studying social class, would be able to contribute to such studies and also perhaps learn something from them.
Another audience member writes that the populations of the Allied powers in World War II were reasonably united behind the war effort. Do you think that a future major conflict would command the same support from the population?
I think we'll have, well, I won't say wait and see, because that sounds like I want it to happen. But, I think we often get, every generation, you get people saying, oh, people won't fight anymore. They don't care about their countries. They're all totally selfish. You had this in Britain before the Second World War. I mean, one of the things that fed into appeasement was a fear among leading politicians and opinion makers that the British people, and the British young in particular, weren't prepared to fight in a war. You know, there was that famous or infamous debate at the Oxford Union, which is the home of many silly debates, and continues to keep up that grand tradition. And the Oxford Union voted that this house will not fight for king or country. And it gave, of course, people who were watching in Germany, such as Adolf Hitler, great encouragement. But when the war came, the British public was really united. And I think it's partly because it had become convinced that there was no way of stopping Hitler short of war. And so if appeasement did anything that was positive, it was actually exhausting all the other alternatives to going to war with Hitler. And I think it took the British public a while to realize, as it took many of the British leaders a while to realize, that Hitler was bent on war. But once they realized that, I think they came into the war united. So I don't think we know how we would react until we're confronted with a warlike situation. And I think societies where there's a high level of trust in leaders or strong patriotism will probably find themselves united when it comes to wars. It doesn't mean you don't have disagreements, and it doesn't mean you don't disagree over how the war is being fought or how the burdens of that war are being borne. But I think we find, that there will be strong social cohesion when sometimes we're surprised by it. So I think impossible to predict how different societies will react until they're confronted. It'll depend on the war itself. If people feel it's an unjust war, then they're not going to support it. But if they feel it's a war that they have to fight for whatever reason, perhaps to simply save themselves, then they will, I think, go into that war with a lot more unity.
And one might add that if they think the effort is simply futile, they will sour on it, as happened with domestic American sentiment in the case of the Vietnam War.
Yeah. Well, I think increasingly Americans wondered what they were doing in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. What were the crucial American interests that meant the United States was going halfway around the world to fight in a very small Asian country, and why were young Americans dying there? And the Americans who led that war, I think, never really explained to the satisfaction of the American public what it is that the United States was doing there. And I think the war, you're right, became increasingly unpopular. And democracies have trouble carrying on very unpopular wars. Even authoritarian states do. One of the things that brought the Soviet Union down was its invasion of Afghanistan and the mounting costs of that invasion, and the incompetence of the Russians or the Soviets running the war in Afghanistan. So even authoritarian regimes have trouble, I think, carrying on very unpopular wars.
What about the role of the mass media in covering war? We talked about Vietnam for a couple of minutes. Michael Arlen, when he was television critic for the New Yorker, wrote a book calling Vietnam: The Living Room War, in which that I think that helped to popularize the notion that it was going to be very difficult to sustain support for a war when the casualties and the blood and the gore were broadcast on the evening news every night. Now that whereas previous wars, not always successfully, there have been various attempts at censorship. But what do you think the role of mass media coverage of war has been on popular willingness to support military adventures?
Well, I think depending on the degree of coverage and the type of coverage and the freedom that the press have to cover it, coverage of unpopular and costly wars can help to undermine public support. And I think those running wars are often very aware of that. I mean, in the First World War, the British and the French were, and indeed the other side, the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, were pretty strict about what they allowed to be reported. And official British war artists and photographers, for example, were not allowed to show dead bodies when they portrayed the fighting, although some, of course, did. And that was, I think, a very deliberate decision on the part of the government, and you might say deception, to try and keep people from fully understanding the true costs of the war, although as time went by, of course, it was impossible to really conceal what those were. Vietnam, I think, was interesting because it was really, I think, the first television war. It wasn't just a still photograph, and it wasn't a film, although there was film, of course, being used before Vietnam. But in Vietnam, the military allowed a tremendous freedom. I mean, I'm always struck by how journalists and photographers and people making films, videos, were jumping on and off military aircraft and seemed to have very, very free access. And the lesson that I think a lot of people in the US drew from that, particularly in the US military, was don't ever let them have that access again. Mm-hmm. And I think it was very striking that when the British got involved in the Falklands, they kept very strict censorship indeed. And the Americans noticed that with a certain amount of approval. And the Americans, I think, and others have been very much more cautious about what they allow to be shown from fields. But of course, the technology is always outstripping the censorship. In the First World War, the authorities tried to prevent photographs being taken of the worst sides of the trenches and the corpses. But the Kodak camera, little cheap camera that you could put in the pocket of a uniform, any soldier could afford. And so suddenly all sorts of photographs started coming out and being sent home. And what is happening today, people are taking things on their phones. Mm-hmm. I mean, things are coming from Afghanistan or Iraq. Ordinary soldiers are simply taking pictures on their phone, sending them home, uploading them. And so I think it's more and more difficult for those in charge who would like to keep a tight clamp on what sort of news comes out, more and more difficult for them to do so simply because of the technology.
It seems as if people have been warning of the blurring of the line between peace and war, writes one of our audience members. How much truth is there to these claims, and how should we understand the relationship between war and certain political warfare activities such as disinformation and cyber warfare?
Well, I tend to stick to a fairly, because if you start redefining war, it covers almost everything. I mean, we have wars on poverty, we have wars on obesity. I once read a book, I was on a book jury, and there was a book, it didn't win, called My War on My Husband's Cholesterol. So, you know, the language of war becomes very broad. And I tend really to think at the core of war is organized violence. But there are things that happen in war, like propaganda, which we were just talking about, the attempts to control the information that comes out of the battlefields, or the attempts to tell a particular story of the war, which are adjuncts to war and a part of the war effort, but I don't see them as war itself. But we face now a new sort of battlefield, and so I'm still trying to think about whether we talk about this as war, and that, of course, is cyber war. Mm-hmm. And that's not organized violence, although it has potential consequences that could be violent. I mean, if someone got hold of the grid that controls the electricity or controls the water supplies of a city or whole society, people will die. But is that war in this sense of the application of organized violence to achieve an end? And I would tend to argue, but I may be wrong, that it's an adjunct to war. And the sort of misinformation, the sorts of things that the Russians are doing, for example, which are very old tactics for Russia. They've been using them ever since the Bolsheviks took over, trying to sow dissension in Western societies, trying to set one part of society against the other. I mean, the 1920s and 30s, they did it through print, and they did it through front organizations, and they've now become much more sophisticated, and they're using the new social media, and they're using the power of the internet. That, it seems to me, is furthering strategic aims, and you can use the language of warfare, but it seems to me that perhaps it's not quite the same as organized violence. But you know, I think war is changing so rapidly that we may have to accept that cyber war is a part of the battlefield and is a part of organized, or the attempt to have the organized application of violence against another society.
Okay, let's see if we've got any more questions from our audience. If you a reminder, if you have a question, please submit it through the Zoom Q&A function. No? Okay. It looks as if we're done. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Margaret McMillan, for giving us a very illuminating talk on your new book.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the good questions, both yours and from the audience. And it was a pleasure to be here. I just wish we could all be doing it in person. I have such fond memories of the Munk Center, and so perhaps one day there'll be a real as opposed to a virtual event there.
I hope so too.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks. Same to you.